making it easier for foreigners to work and become citizens. So this is important because here you have a country that is experiencing its own set of problems based around a shrinking population. It's got an aging population, and people are dying at a rate, I won't say that's faster than younger people are being born, but certainly in a way that is slowly shrinking the working age population. And they are, unlike here, apparently, they are more aware that they need to do something about it. So here's this story for you in that context. I don't know. Anyway, while in Tokyo earlier this month, I couldn't help but notice how the city has changed. Where once it was rare to hear any language other than Japanese spoken on the street, now it happens constantly. Most of this is due to the huge tourism boom. More than 30 million people now visit Japan every year. But obscured by that vast influx of guests is a longer-term trend. Tokyo is becoming a much more ethnically diverse city. I encountered black store clerks from the Netherlands and Africa, Chinese waiters at traditional Japanese restaurants, South Asian students staffing convenience stores, a white waitress at Starbucks, a Korean restaurant run by Southeast Asians. These are anecdotes, but there's data to back them up. In 2018, 1 out of 8 young people turning 20 in Tokyo wasn't born in Japan. That doesn't even count the people who were born in Japan but aren't ethnically Japanese. Although Tokyo isn't close to becoming a multiracial metropolis, like, say, New York City or London, the word homogeneous no longer fits the city. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. Tokyo is an early harbinger of changes that are coming, albeit more slowly, to the rest of Japan. The capital city's diversity is in large part the result of Japan's increasingly open stance towards immigration. Japan's foreign-born population is still small compared to most other rich countries, a legacy of the highly restrictive attitudes and policies towards immigration that prevailed in the past years. But since Shinzo Abe became prime minister at the end of 2012, the number of foreign-born people working in the country has expanded steadily. The government reckons that there are now about 2.73 million foreigners living in the country, a 6.6% increase over the previous year, even as the overall population shrinks rapidly. In recent years, the Abe administration has adopted major changes that will probably sustain the influx of immigrants. In 2017, Japan implemented fast-track permanent residency for skilled workers. In 2018, it passed a law that will greatly expand the number of blue-collar work visas and, crucially, provide these workers with a path to permanent residency if they want it. These changes thus represent true immigration, as opposed to temporary guest worker policies, despite the common use of the term guest worker law to describe the new visas. In time, it will mean a more ethnically diverse Japanese citizenry. Permanent residents are allowed to apply for Japanese citizenship after 5 years. Some foreigners will also marry Japanese nationals, and their children will thus be citizens as well. Since the new law prevents visa holders from bringing families with them to Japan, many of the new workers will likely be single people looking for spouses, making them more likely to marry locals. While this new immigration will help keep Japan's economy and pension system afloat, it will inevitably introduce social strains. Unlike the U.S., Canada, and other nations whose populations are mainly a hodgepodge of the descendants of recent immigrants, Japan has little history of mass immigration. The one major recent episode of immigration was the movement of Koreans to Japan during the Japanese colonization of Korea and later during the Korean War. Due to Japan's lack of birthright citizenship, the descendants of those immigrants have become a racialized minority, speaking no Korean but bearing Korean passports. Discrimination against these people, sometimes called Zainichi Koreans, was severe for decades, and though it has decreased substantially in recent years, a far-right fringe has emerged to persecute and slander the Zainichi. Abe, despite being a conservative on foreign policy issues, has not tolerated these groups. In 2016, Japan passed its first law against hate speech, which is now being used to prosecute members of this group. But the episode shows that Japanese society probably won't be immune to the waves of nativist populism that have rocked Western countries in recent years. If even ethnic Koreans, who are generally physically indistinguishable from ethnic Japanese people, face persecution, people of visibly different racial groups may encounter even more. An early sign of such tensions emerged in 2015 when a beauty pageant winner, who was ethnically half Japanese and half black, became the center of an online controversy, with some criticizing her for not being Japanese enough and others leaping to her defense. For now, the racial purists have generally been shouted down, and a half-Indian woman won the Miss World Japan pageant in 2016 with little backlash. But as the number of mixed and minority people in Japan becomes more prominent, the rightists can be expected to return with fresh rage. More generally, Japan's institutions are not used to coping with foreign and minority residents. Unlike in the U.S., where English as a second language classes are widely available, Japan has few classes to assist non-native speakers to catch up in Japanese fluency, nor do Japanese cities have many official celebrations of immigrant culture or contributions. So Japan is beginning a major and unprecedented exercise, similar in some ways to the experiments embarked on by many European countries. Japan is still far from being a diverse country, but it's no longer quite right to call it homogeneous. The next 2 or 3 decades will reveal whether the country's culture and institutions will be able to learn from Europe's experience and manage a smooth transition, or whether immigration will spark a nativist backlash that closes the country off once again. Excuse me. So there you have a fairly conservative government, I would say. The Abe government is definitely on the conservative side. I mean, he even buddies up with Trump in some ways, but he seems, at least, to be a little more realistic about some things anyway, or at least not intent on using immigration and racism as a tool for keeping in power, as Trump most certainly does. So let's continue on this in the same vein, and talk a little bit about how people are kept out and why they're kept out, and what sorts of things lead to that kind of way of thinking, I guess you might say. So this is entitled "The Last Time a Wall Went Up to Keep Out Immigrants." So this is about a book called The Guarded Gate, I believe. Bigotry, Eugenics, and the Law That Kept 2 Generations of Jews, Italians, and Other European Immigrants Out of America. It's by Daniel Okrent. And the story reads as follows. Today's vehement demands to stop immigrants are neither new nor proportional to their numbers. Immigrants arriving between 2000 and 2010 constituted approximately 3% of the United States population, while those arriving between 1900 and 1910 constituted 8.9% of the population. The nativist movement, as anti-immigrant campaigns were once called, began a century and a half ago, directed first against the Irish, later against those arriving from southern and eastern Europe. The case against these European immigrants was remarkably similar to today's complaints about those at our gates. They steal jobs from the native-born. They are costly to taxpayers. They don't respect American values, and they are inclined to be criminals. And let me point out here that this person seems to have ignored the Chinese Exclusion Act and all that sort of thing in his story. So we are focusing apparently on one particular period of time and a particular group of individuals, as opposed to the entire history of anti-immigrant sentiment here in the United States. But We'll leave that point for the moment. Okay, so this does not mean that history repeats itself. Up through at least the 1920s, nativists primarily targeted Catholics and Jews, and their bigotry was quite possibly shared by the majority of white Protestant Americans. Still, in a vivid new book by Daniel Okren, who was the first public editor of the New York Times, The Guarded Gate, jam-packed with appalling examples, most readers will be unable to miss the book's implication for present-day anti-immigration sentiment. Okren's is largely an intellectual history, if we can use that term to describe the shoddy thinking of his subjects, of nativist ideology and ideologues from the mid-19th century to the first comprehensive immigration restriction law of 1924. Again, that's not correct. That is not the first comprehensive. Anyway, he explores who these nativist leaders were and how their elite status allowed them to pass off bogus claims as science. Nativist leaders were among the most distinguished men of the country, upper class, highly educated, and Protestant, men who personally had nothing to fear from new immigrants. Let me introduce some of them. Charles Benedict Davenport, Harvard graduate, Harvard professor, descendant of Puritans. Robert de Courcy Ward, whose ancestors arrived with John Winthrop, Prescott Farnsworth Hall. Prescott Farnsworth Hall, who descended from Charlemagne. Charles Warren, whose ancestors came on the Mayflower. H. Fairfield Osborne, son of a railroad tycoon, president of the New American Museum of Natural History. Henry Cabot Lodge, of whom Okrent writes, quote, "There wasn't a box on the Brahmin checklist he didn't tick," end quote. Their class privilege is important because then as now, critics tend to associate bigotry with poor, uneducated, rural, and working-class people, a misleading analysis. All scientists and all boasting familiarity with Mendelian genetics, these nativists nevertheless considered loyalty and shiftlessness, for example, to be genetic characteristics. Davenport's 1919 The Trait Book listed 3,500 human genetics attributes, each assigned a numerical value. These included forwardness, forehead low, fondness of children, frivolousness. Osborne opined that education and environment do not fundamentally alter racial values. To gather facts about who could become desirable Americans, nativist leaders sought public opinion, but their respondents were limited to men listed in Who's Who. Harvard Medical School graduates, prominent white Southerners, and labor union officials such as Samuel Gompers, an ardent restrictionist. This extremely non-random sample reflected the kind of people whose opinions these scientists respected. Leaving nothing to chance, their survey used a multiple-choice questionnaire. Respondents were asked to rank several groups in order of desirability: native-born, persons from Northern Europe, skilled persons, families with some money, intending to settle in the country, British, Scandinavians, and Germans. Henry Goddard's famed Kallikak study of defectives pursued more than 30 states to impose forced sterilization on the feeble-minded. He also tested arrivals at Ellis Island and found that 83% of the Jews, 80% of Hungarians, and 79% of Italians were either morons or imbeciles. Really? Have a drink of water for that. Misunderstanding what was and wasn't genetic led to enthusiasm for eugenics, the science of human breeding. Not all eugenics was discriminatory. In the late 19th century, progressive reformers used eugenic arguments for improving public health through, for example, the promotion of healthy pregnancies. But by the 1920s, eugenicists were ranking ethnic groups as superior or inferior, and their work was considered state-of-the-art science taught in standard biology textbooks. Up to World War II, nativist bigotry could be found across the political spectrum. Socialists, anarchists, civil rights leaders, including W.E.B. Du Bois, Jewish leaders and feminists tried unsuccessfully to formulate progressive versions of eugenics. Few of the mainstream eugenicists, however, considered Jews and people of color as desirable immigrants. The young Eleanor Roosevelt, who would later become an outspoken anti-racist, described someone as an interesting little man but very Jew, and allowed that she'd rather be hung than attend another Jew party. The most influential opposition to nativism came from a different sector of the wealthy, industrialists who wanted the cheap labor only immigrants could provide. Ockrent's discussion misses a major aspect of eugenics, anxiety about falling fertility among educated women. When Theodore Roosevelt spoke of race suicide as a national problem, he was worrying that a significant minority of privileged women were not marrying and reproducing. They chose to be single and in some cases to form romantic partnerships with other women because dominant gender norms labeled employment and public activism improper activities for married women. Supremely confident of their objectivity, nativist leaders sought to put eugenics into practice. Willett Hayes, a plant breeder, proposed that each American be assigned an 11-digit number name, a score of their genetic lineage, to guarantee their mating with those of equal general excellence. Ockrent reproduces a sample report of an individual's physical, mental, and temperamental qualities. Eugenicists persuaded the Public Health Service to offer certificates of eugenic suitability for marriage. Ew. The temperature of nativist bigotry reached new heights in the World War I era through the efforts of Madison Grant, also a proud descendant of Puritans. His 1916 book, The Passing of the Great Race, promoted the myth that the master race was facing extinction. This view, incidentally, was recently borrowed by the white nationalists in Charlottesville, Virginia, who were chanting, "Jews will not replace us." Eugenic claims became increasingly absurd. Dante and Leonardo were Nordics. Marco Polo and Galileo were really Germans. Jesus was not a Jew. Nativism's denouement was the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924. Previous immigration restrictions targeted particular groups, notably people from Asia. But this comprehensive law aimed not just to limit immigration, but to preserve white Protestant dominance in America. It assigned a quota to each nation, ranging from 51,000 for Germany to 2,000 for Russia, to 1,100 for the entire African continent. The Northern Ku Klux Klan drummed up support for the law, claiming that America was ordained by God to be a white Protestant nation. Ockrent slights the Klan's influence, understandably, because his book is a history of elite nativist spokesmen rather than a social history. But recognizing the Klan's campaign can serve as a reminder that bigotry has no life of its own. It needs deliberate promotion. The 1920s KKK gained astonishing strength, 4 to 6 million members, and operated a sophisticated lobbying and get-out-the-vote machine, putting into office 11 governors, 45 congressmen, and hundreds of state, county, and municipal officials. The Klan identified Congressman Albert Johnson, chairman of the House Immigration Committee, shepherded the anti-immigration bill into enactment. The law remained in effect until 1965 with some dreadful consequences. To name just one, it justified the refusal to accept refugees from Nazism, including 20,000 Jewish children. Equally chilling in Ockrent's documentation of American influence on Nazi race hygiene, as early as 1932, Walter Schultz of the Nazi euthanasia program called on German geneticists to heed the example of the United States. The Nazi Handbook for Law and Legislation cited American immigration law as a model for Germany. Osborne complained that negative press about the Nazis resulted from Jewish influence. Perhaps paradoxically, it was the Nazi genocide that stigmatized eugenics forever. But bigotry was by no means buried by World War II. Its targets are fungible, but it typically blames disadvantaged groups for problems more often created by privileged groups. It is a stream that sometimes been forced underground, and some argue that polite, whispered racism is as bad as the loud kind. Okrent's history belies that argument. Quiet bigotry should be condemned, but when it is shouted and legitimated by people with power and influence, it can become deadly. So, I'm not expecting, I'm not expecting anyone other than somebody that already understands this to listen to this. But, I mean, how obvious is it? What's going on today? What has gone on in the past? Where it's coming from? I mean, I know we're supposed to be understanding and to open ourselves to conversation with people with different points of view. And I am all about talking to people with different points of view, but I am not all about opening myself to conversation with people whose basic moral underpinning is completely different from mine. I will, as in the first article, try to figure out how to speak to people who have different priorities from mine. But there is a large group of people out there right now, starting at the top, the president, and going on down the line to his supporters, that is operating currently based on greed, selfishness, and bigotry, racism, all those things. And they have to be stopped, not reasoned with, not catered to, not accommodated, but just simply stopped in their tracks. They have to be thrown out of office. If they're in office of any sort, they have to be removed from having any power in this society. And whatever it takes to do that, that's what we have to do, I believe. It's vital to the future of this country that we do that. It's happened before. We got rid of the KKK once, more or less. They're back again a little bit, but not like they used to be. And they just need to be removed again. The new KKK, now MAGA, MAGA, Make America Great Again type, are really not very different from the KKK, honestly, I have to say. And they have to be removed from power in any way that we can do it. So I only have a few minutes left. I had another story which was kind of interesting and sort of funny. I'll read as much of it as I can because I just thought it was appropriate to consider this. It is entitled, "Trump Himself Wouldn't Be an American Under His New Immigration Plan." Donald Trump presented a new immigration reform proposal today at the White House that would upend the United States' long history of welcoming the poor, striving, and needy, and reserve citizenship for people with higher education and fat paychecks. The United States has for too long based its immigration policies on family ties and luck, Trump said. Currently, 66% of legal immigrants come here on the basis of random chance. They're admitted solely because they have a relative in the United States, and it doesn't matter who that relative is, he said, sounding somewhat incredulous. This is true. About 60% of the U.S. legal permanent residents in 2015 were admitted because of family ties, a figure that's held relatively constant in recent years. Only 12% of legal immigrants are chosen based on skill or merit, Trump said, and he proposes to bring the number up to 57%. This will bring us in line with other countries and make us globally competitive. These highly skilled people will be allowed to bring in their families, he noted. They go right to the front of the line where they should be, end quote. A new points-based system would reward younger workers, those with valuable skills, offers of employment, advanced education, plans to create jobs, and higher wage workers, he said. The reform idea was crafted almost entirely by two of President Trump's presidential advisors, son-in-law Jared Kushner and Stephen Miller. Current and former Department of Homeland Security officials told Quartz that proposal has almost zero input from the agency. DHS is almost entirely responsible for U.S. immigration, including vetting applicants and handling visa applications and asylum claims. Congress members and immigration experts give Trump's immigration reform idea little chance of passing. To say it's dead on arrival would be generous, said Phil Tobar, the executive director of America's Voice, a watchdog agency. Trump has long railed against chain migration, a term used by anti-immigrant activists to describe the U.S.'s prioritization of family ties in immigration decisions. But it has been the backbone of U.S. economic growth and prosperity for generations, bringing waves of desperate and driven people from war and famine-riddled homelands who created entire new cities and industries in the U.S. Were his immigration reform proposal in place in the United States 100 years ago, it would have meant many members of the Trump White House would never have been Americans at all. Trump has touted his Scottish ancestry, but not his family's dependence on chain migration. In 1929, Trump's mother, Mary Ann McLeod, left Glasgow at age 17 on the SS Transylvania, ooh, how appropriate, to join a well-established community of countrymen and women, the New Yorker wrote in June of 2016. This included two of her sisters in New York City. Vice President Pence's grandfather, Richard Cawley, immigrated to the U.S. from County Mayo, Ireland, along with four of his siblings, as former Ancestry.com chief historian Megan Smolyanek writes on Medium. They were so orderly that they immigrated in age sequence, with Richard's oldest brother James starting things off by going to an aunt in Illinois. He then helped Richard, who helped Thomas, who helped the sisters, one of tidiest set of chain migration links I've ever encountered. The Cawleys were fortunate. Though the Emergency Immigration Act of 1921 had restricted immigration, it favored Northern and Western European nationalities, such as the Irish. Had they been Italian or Slavic, much less from anywhere other than Europe, the odds would have been stacked against them. Kushner's paternal grandparents were Holocaust survivors, the Washington Post reported. Joseph and Ray Kushner came to the United States in 1949 as impoverished Eastern European refugees and spent years in a camp in Italy for displaced persons waiting to be admitted to the U.S. In a 1982 interview given by the late Ray Kushner to a Holocaust research center, Jared's grandmother talks about how wrong she felt it was for the United States to let people like her and her husband languish in those camps for years, awaiting permission to enter the country. The presidential advisor has had an outsized influence on the Trump White House immigration decisions, including pressing for new citizenship rules, including a requirement to speak English, which Trump mentioned in the Rose Garden today. Miller's own great-grandmother could not speak English, notes Jennifer Mendelson, a journalist turned genealogist who created Resistance Genealogy to follow Trump's White House members' immigration histories. His great-grandfather, Neeson Miller, failed a U.S. citizenship test because of ignorance, but was allowed to remain in the country. His maternal great-grandfather traveled to the U.S. via chain migration, joining relatives who arrived in America with just $8 to their name, the Jewish Journal reports. Well, there you have it. You have been listening to CU Immigration here on WRFU LP Urbana, 104.5 FM. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you later.